There are several things I want to do today. First, I want to know what you got out of the commentary of last week of the Lady Eve. Second, I want to know what you got out of the reading for today, the chapter of mine on imagination and the chapter on idealization. Third, I want to give you a little preparation about today's movie, which is Amélie. And fourth, there are some supplementary material that I can give you, particularly in relation to the aesthetics that you were reading for the second week out of Reality Transformed, which I asked you to read for last week. Isn't that right? Yeah. All right. The result is that I'm going to try to talk as little as possible, and this will get us started with the part of course, in which your discussion is very important. I want to know how any of this material is affecting you. What I'm going to do is go around the class the way I do every time in order to get to know you better and remember your names. But when I get to your name, you can, and I hope you will, stop me to make any comments you want on any of those things that I mentioned. Reality Transformed, imagination, idealization, the Lady Eve, and the commentary on the Lady Eve. And if any of you, for instance, Carrie here, know Amélie, you can say something about that. So this is the time for the class to become fully involved, as I hope you will be throughout the term. First, let me start on my list. And forgive me if I am still learning your names, because I haven't seen you for a week. Edward Song. Anything you want to say in your defense?
I don't know, just in the reading, I don't really have a very strong background in philosophy, so I find it kind of interesting to just learn about the different theories that you mentioned as you're resolving the differences a lot of times between two conflicting theories, and I find that pretty interesting, just to get more background.
What did you get out of the chapter on imagination?
I guess when I was...
You've done that for this week?
Right. So I guess I realized that imagination actually takes part in a lot of different things that you don't really attribute to it. And once you sit there and think about just what kind of things go into making decisions and even coming up with new ideas, that imagination does play a large part in all of it.
Okay. Remember your back is to the camera, and I don't know how much of what you're saying is adequate, but in general, project as much as you can, as if you were on a stage. Don't sit back and mumble the way MIT students like to do. Not you in particular, but all of you. All right? Any question about that? David Levinson.
I was thinking on the comment on the Lady Eve, like how you were saying, it's really interesting that the woman's perspective on how, I never really noticed how Eve's clothing and general appearance changed when after Hopsy found out that she was a card shark, and how she started dressing more formally almost, as opposed to informally. And
more elegant.
More elegant, yeah.
Right.
Less approachable and more just more elegant and more unapproachable and more Lady Eve, I thought that was an interesting commentary.
Right. All people have their warm side and their cold side. And given the way in which women have been treated by men, it's not surprising that the cold side often turns out to be a defended, icy self-protection that different kind of women can turn into an art form. And what's interesting along those lines is that once Jean becomes Eve, or just before she becomes Eve, after she's been hurt, after she's been rejected as Jean, let's say, we see how sophisticated she can be in her cold manner with the fur hat and the fur coat and the withdrawn manner that she has. Notice, incidentally, that Charles, who is also hurt but in a different way, he is sort of blank. He looks over the railing. He doesn't look elegant. He just looks depressed and miserable, whereas she is making her miserable into a work of art, misery into a work of art. So they're the two sides of women. And in general, I think, as I mentioned in the first class, there is the tradition in the myth of creation of Eve, who is the mother of humanity, and therefore a motherly image, but one who also has somehow fallen from grace, indicating maybe there's another side to her. And that other side, in a good deal of Talmudic mythology, for instance, appears in a being called Lilith, who is really the first woman, and she is the earth spirit and generally thought to be evil. Now, there's a good deal of male sexology involved in this, attitudes of males towards women. Women can be motherly, but they can also be somehow destructive or vile or evil, without analyzing how it is that men put them into that condition. So in a sense, the movie is reopening all of that. There are these two sides of Eve, and it results from the inability on the part of the male to accept her as she is, or to have learned the lesson that she was trying to teach when he confronts her with a photograph, or just actually before he confronts her with a photograph, that the good girls aren't as good as men think, and the girls aren't anywhere as bad as men think they can be. So that there are people, women in particular, have a mixture of the two, and what isn't spelled out, but it's obvious given their social order. He's very wealthy, he's a member of the elite, he went to Yale, and she's just a girl on the ship. It's because the ruling class, the males, have arranged it that way, that he is responsible for the separation between these two aspects of female character. And so what she's doing is teaching him a lesson. All right, you think I'm no good? I'll show you how no good I can be. And therefore the separation is accentuated and dramatized, making us wonder about the nature of the myth to begin with. And then at the end, it's overcome because for reasons of her good nature and his good nature, they harmonize the different aspects and live happily ever after, right? So that's the resolution of the problem built into the mythic separation between the different parts of women. Anything else?
That was the most interesting part as well.
Does anybody else want to say anything about the myth of male and female and of creativity in the Lady Eve? I want to make a couple of comments about the commentary. Unfortunately, we couldn't watch it all last time, and I don't want to go back to it now because we have other things, and if anything, the term is so crowded, we'll not, I think, have enough time for your discussions, which I really care about. So I'll rely on what you learned from the commentary itself. But would anybody like to say something about what you learned from that commentary? Remember, my idea was first week you would sit back and enjoy this screwball comedy and the masterpiece of its within its genre, and the second week you would begin to acquire, if you haven't already, what it is to watch a movie by seeing what a highly trained expert, scholar in the field, presents to you as her reading of the movie, and therefore your experiencing of it through her. So what did you get out of Marion Keene's commentary. Remind me of your name. Lux Chen, did you say?
Yeah, Lux.
Right.
So in your book,
Lux, tell me.
So in your book, The Reality Transformed, you talked about how one of the advantages that a filmmaker has is that he can focus the audience's attention on some particular, very specific portion of the stage, or like a particular person talking, and that's something that a person who's doing a ballet, or maybe a person who's just performing on stage, doesn't have, because he can't be sure that the audience's attention is focused on exactly what is important.
And
so,
in terms of the commentary, what particular remarks of her illustrate that?
So I think one scene was when both were in Lady Eve's room on the boat, and she had her arm around him, and it just really focused on just her and him, and you realized there was a lot of tension in the air. And I think the commentary helped to highlight scenes like that, and maybe you realize that in fact that technique was very, very effective and very important.
As you're watching a movie, as I'm watching a movie, I don't think of the fact that this shot is a long shot. This shot is a middle shot. This shot is a close-up, right? The commentator here kept emphasizing that, and in relation to what's really going on, so that the vulnerability of Jean appears in the mid-shot when she's talking to her father and Gerald, and we then see her face differently because somehow the mid-shot has its own special aesthetic character. Or the close-ups, for instance, when she starts crying because she feels that he has misused her after the photograph has been, he reminds her of the photograph, and says that he knew all along, so he was toying with her, and that's what hurts her most of all. You know, that was cheap and vulgar of you, and if you really knew and were doing it just to humiliate me. And we feel that, particularly in the great presentation of Barbara Stanwyck, because it's a close-up, and our attention is called to the fact that it's close-up. Now that's the kind of thing I was hoping you would get from the commentary. There are other things as well. Does anybody else want to say something about that? About the utility of the commentary as a way of helping you to get the technical devices and find points that enable the movie to convey the feelings and the reality that it does?
Oh, I mean,
no, don't tell me. Peter.
Yeah. I guess the whole
Peter's
commentary
son.
was based on the cinematography of the movie, right? It wasn't anything to do with the storyline or any.
Well,
how sorry, I've only seen half the movie, but what's the name?
Given what the
story. The main male character is convinced that when he sees Eve for the second time as the Duchess, how he's convinced that it's not, the woman he met at the boat. I wish there was more explanation of how things, the storyline works out in the movie instead of just depicting this is a close-up shot and this is what it means.
No, but it's more than just the technique. It's also the story. For instance, when the commentary calls attention to the fuzziness in the image when Charles is on his knees putting on the new shoes to Barbara Stanwyck. He's close to her sexual region, and so his mind goes fuzzy and it's swimming around, and we see it in the image. Well, calling our attention to the nature of that fuzzy image is a way of indicating the state of his mind, and you might have missed that if you hadn't had that pointed out to you. What's important is the two go together. I mean, this is an effective way of doing that. So I think you may not be doing her justice, that she tells you, it's more than just telling you the angles, I mean the close-ups and non-close-ups. At the same time, anybody wants to say anything more about this? Karen, go ahead.
Well, the scene we've been talking about, well, no, actually, the scene he mentioned, not the one putting on the shoe. I didn't really understand why it was so watchable at first, because I did realize afterwards, like, that the camera was just in one position for the whole time, and very little happened. But like I was entertained the whole time. But then I realized, like, sort of as she was talking about it, and just that works, like, and then it's like it's very stylistic. And I don't think you see it nearly as much in cinema today. It's just that long shot where the camera's not moving at all.
Well, possibly some of you will want to read my new book that I mentioned, Three Philosophical Filmmakers, Hitchcock, Wells, and Renoir, because in the chapter on Renoir, I discussed his intention for a long stretch of his career not to move the camera. When he was younger, he used to move it with a great deal. And then later, he developed his ideas about the actors being the real directors, and the function of the so-called director is to give them an opportunity to show forth what there is in the movie. And that if the camera is too active, then your attention gets deflected away from the actors to the cinematography. And so in his later period, he let the camera remain stationary as much as possible. But the point is that he would also, at crucial moments, make certain effects by moving the camera the way he does. So that, I think, is part of what was going on. Sturgis does both move the camera and leave it stationary, and there's a meaning for the different uses, particularly in his case, because I think the movie is a masterpiece, and that when he does one or the other, it's with the reason of conveying ideas and doing it very effectively. At this point, I do want to say something about the commentary that belongs to the part you didn't see. But I'm sure you all remember the scene when Charles proposes to Eve, right, the second half, in a way that she had predicted, saying, one day we'll be out on riding horses and going through a glade, and then we'll come upon this incredible sunset, and we'll have to stop and watch it. And, you know, the sunset is a kind of cliche of some romantic place in which people fall in love with each other in a very idealistic way, right? And of course, this is being satirized. It's satirized by Eve, and also satirized with evil intent, because she's chosen that as a trick to catch him, to make sure he proposes, put him in the right mood. But it's also satirized by the filmmaker. And so we have to keep both of these in mind. The reason I'm bringing this up right now is that incredible and wonderful, funny scene in which the horse keeps nuzzling the back of Charles's head while he's trying to propose to Eve, right? And what I can't now remember what the commentator says, but I had the feeling at the time that she sort of misses the point. The point is not that this is the filmmaker talking about the making of films, which is a recurrent theme in her analysis. The theme itself goes back to ideas of Stanley Cavell, the professor at Harvard I told you, who wrote that book called The World Viewed, and had many students at Harvard, and I think Marion King may have been a student of his, and she refers to his book, Pursuits of Happiness, in relation to the idea of movies being self-reflexive. Let me get into a little digression here. You remember the scenes when Charles is standing on the deck of the ship and these strange men go back and forth? and she interprets them as being comments by the film director to the fact that it's really a Hollywood scene. It's not really on a ship. And so it raises all kinds of aesthetic questions about what is the reality of films, because it's all being done under artificial conditions, but it's supposed to look like the real thing, right? And then that comes back when there are the strange men who walk past the father when he's trying to get his breakfast and has his infantile fit, remember? Again, she interprets that way, that these are walk-ons. And one says, I can't speak. And she said, well, maybe that's because if you're an extra, and you get less money than people who speak. And he was just an extra, so he couldn't speak. And all of this seemed to me very far-fetched. And I'm a critic of the Cavell view about the reflexivity of films. But I think the great opportunity for seeing the hand of the cinematographer occurs in the scene with the horse. Because here's Charles trying to propose and being maneuvered and sort of following the script that she has written, because earlier she said, one day we'll be out and so on, and the horse will nuzzle my neck. As a matter of fact, did you notice the horse doesn't nuzzle her neck? It's Charles, and she turns and angrily to say to the horse, stop that. She was wrong. Her prediction didn't come true at that moment, but the rest of it is the way she predicted it, because the horse is nuzzling, but it's nuzzling Charles's. Now this delicate shift, is obviously a contrived remark, a kind of commentary by the filmmaker, and it's very funny when you realize the details. But it's even funnier when you think of what Charles is saying. He's saying these platitudes about their having come out of the glade and having known each other all the way back. And the horse is sort of saying, oh, cut it out. It's as if the horse was trying to knock some horse sense into Charles. He's saying, what you're saying is absurd, and Charles keeps pushing him off and fighting against this interference in order to keep on talking coherently. Also, it makes one wonder, where is Charles likely to find love? People assume that you find love from a person who is also a human being. And of course, in this period of history, a human being of the opposite sex. So Charles is looking for love out of the woman he wants to marry. But it's possible, as any lover of pets will tell you, that you can get more love, or a different kind of love, but maybe a better, truer love from certain animals, dogs, for instance, who are wonderfully faithful and loyal, horses that can obey you and show a kind of love. And it's as if the horse is saying, forget about her, what about me? and whatever your view about the nature of love is, between animals or human beings, it's very funny. And it's funny because one has to sort of hear the joking manner, one has to hear the cinematic voice of the filmmaker. And if you don't hear that, then you're missing something. If you just, because it'll say, why is the horse doing that? Why didn't the filmmaker stop it and say, do it again and hold on to the horse a little differently, or train the horse, take him out, let's get a horse that's better trained. On the contrary, obviously that's what Sturgis wanted, because it is so funny and because it has all of these ramifications. Now that, I think, is something you would learn to look for, and the commentary you see has elicited this from me, because it was only after I saw that commentary that I got these ideas. And that, I think, is a very useful phenomenon in the case of what you were watching last week. So it's not merely a question of technique, it's not merely a question of close shots and long shots, it's also with these philosophical overtones in the context of the greatest myth in the world, the myth of creation. Some experts say that all myths are myths of creation. That's not true. But the myth of creation, for instance, in the Bible, is a very fertile and exciting myth, whether or not you believe the Bible is the Word of God. As mythology, it has things that everybody has to learn. Okay. Since I didn't call your name, Carrie, why don't you continue in any way you want?
Well, I wanted to talk about imagination, as you talked about it.
Okay, let's get into imagination and idealization, those two chapters, not very long, that I asked you to read today, and that I hope you'll go back to and reread.
I think it was actually in the idealization chapter that you
Go
were
ahead.
talking about Chekhov's story, The Kiss,
Yeah.
and how there's multiple epiphanies happening in that, like sort of connections between an imaginary world and an actual world. And thinking about that in relation to how imagination operates in Amelie, it's very contrasting, because here you have this person who has their imagination working in The Kiss, and then turns out that it just turns out very badly for him. And that's actually like how he becomes affected, is through these moments where his imagination is either inspired or decayed. And with Amelie, it ends very good, and she has a very fertile imagination throughout. And it seems as if their fertile imaginations are coming together, and it's very much a success of the imagination.
Would you say that her imagination is good in every respect?
I mean, I think it's a person's interior world, and their confidence in their interior world relates to their imagination.
But she does these nasty things.
I don't think anything she does is that. I mean, everything she does is
Oh no,
productive.
the poor fruit seller who goes out of his mind and ends up in, I won't anticipate,
Well,
but you know, who
it is
in consternation because of her
it is true.
her imagination.
It's definitely an idealization of the imagination, or people who have fertile imaginations, elevating them above the everyday people.
We don't feel about it. We don't feel it the way we do with somebody who willfully murders another person to get his money. We think of it perhaps as poetic justice, because he's a man without imagination. So it's only poetically right that a person with it should sort of put him in his place and punish him and show us what comes of not having imagination.
Not only that, but by what she does, it keeps to having to use his imagination to understand what's happening to him. It's this totally irrational things, and so you can sort of see him whenever any of these things happen.
Right.
It's like, how did that happen? And he immediately just says, well, I must have done that. He doesn't like imagine her coming into her, which could happen eventually with him. So
And also she does it in a good cause, because the reason she feels she has to punish him is because of his bad behavior. But you all will experience this. Now, in relation to Amélie, the reason I wanted to show you the movie is not only because it is all predicated upon the very nature of imagination, as you will see instantly, in Amélie, but it's also a very imaginative movie, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why it became a worldwide triumph, a success beyond any expectation, commercial expectation on the part of the French filmmakers, and it's a wonderful movie. What is this? 5 Academy Award nominations, the feel-good movie of the year, She'll Change Your Life, so on. But also, what I noticed, first of all, I may have mentioned this the first time, and forgive me if I repeat myself occasionally, first time we met, the cinematography is superb. And when I came out of the theater, or seeing it before watching it on DVD, I said to myself, they'll win an Academy Award for the cinematography. So it's so imaginative. It was effects that I hadn't foreseen, that I couldn't have imagined. And it was very, very fertile, but absolutely right, given the fact that the nature of imagination is what it's all about. On top of that, there is also what Carrie was talking about in idealization. Carrie, take the roll call. How many have read the 2 chapters for today? I'm not interested in naming names. I just want to have an idea of what's going on.
I think almost everyone.
Well, then you all know the short story that I discussed by Chekhov. Remember? The point being that the structure of that narrative is built upon the way in which human beings make ideals, and how the ideal of romantic love is the core of the story. The man who's never had it, and then through his imagination sort of creates it for himself, but since the ideal is so remote from his reality, it's fragile, and then he ends up demoralized because it never comes into being. Now that, for me, is a very important aspect of human nature, the fact that we do make ideals, and that I've written a great deal about because for some reason other people haven't. There have been lots of philosophers writing about ideals, but they do it in a way that I felt was inadequate. Plato, for instance, thinks that all reality is struggling towards higher ideals, the highest ideals. That's not what I'm talking about, because often people do things for reasons that can't be explained in Platonic terms. Freud thinks ideals are generally rationalizations, and so when he talks about love, for him that's what he calls idealization, because it is an over-evaluation, it is an overestimation of the beloved, of the other person. Being overs, it means it's inaccurate, it's erroneous, and therefore, to some extent at least, it's going to be based on some kind of illusion. I don't think idealization is necessarily illusory. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but it isn't in the nature of idealization for it to be illusory, and therefore I refuse to reduce it to rationalization or any other category of that sort that Freud uses to explain his theory, to construct his theory. So my view is very different from Freud. It's very different from Plato. All that I mean is the making of ideals. This is a phenomenon, a universal phenomenon among human beings. The way you might say that since we are dimorphic creatures biologically, heterosexual impulse is a universal phenomenon. Doesn't mean that everybody has it on every occasion, and it doesn't mean that any other kind of attraction of a loving and sexual sort is wrong, because I argue there isn't any fixed model, there isn't any biological model that establishes the ideal. So I'm not trying to say that only heterosexual attraction is the norm, but it is a universal thing that we all recognize, and we can explain in terms of the fact that for the species to propagate, there has to be an intimate congress between male and female. All right. Well, in that sort of vein, there are certain fundamentals, and one of them in human nature, one of them, I argue, is the making of ideals. There wouldn't be all the millions, hundreds, and thousands of millions of people who have died because of some ideal, fighting in warfare, or because they're taking care of their family when they should be taking care of themselves, or being artists who neglect to go to the doctor so that they can pursue their arts, all sorts of ways in which a certain ideal, an ideal that could be aesthetic, could be military, could be paternal, could be nationalistic, it can be vain, it can be selfless, all of these are possible ideals, that they are built into us as human beings. We are makers of ideals, or a lot of other things too. That's what I mean by idealization. And in the case of the short story, it's this ideal of romantic love, which is heterosexual and bourgeois, leading to marriage, that propels that short story, and that Chekhov analyzes with exquisite precision and realistic detail. So it's a great short story. All right. In the case of Amélie, how does that come in? Who is motivated by a comparable ideal?
I don't know how to see idealization in Amelie. I mean, she idealizes her own independent self, maybe at the beginning of the movie, and her own, I mean, in the depictions of the Lady Di and her imagination running on that TV script, it talks very much about how she's very, and she idealizes helping other people at some point in the movie. She has this realization that she should help other people, and then
right.
she tries it out once, and it works, and then it keeps going, and it gets, and like just her life
but
keeps getting better.
overarching it all is that it's a love story.
That's true.
So, yeah, there's the ideal of romantic love, finding the right man, and when the man reacts eventually, it's because he is driven by the ideal of finding the right woman. And both of them, but particularly her, because she is the great heroine, does so through methods that are extremely imaginative and show how imagination and idealization go together.
I would say that she's not idealizing. I mean, there is an idealization of love that takes place in the movie, but much more. She's not going after love just because it's love as
right.
much as this is a person that she sees who has. I mean, their inner persons connect.
Okay, well,
through
we'll talk
some
about it
external
again
things.
next time.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to leave plenty of time for the movie, so we don't have much time left for the class. So let me quickly go through the rest and make any comment along the way, and I'll try to be silent if that's conceivable. Miguel Rivera?
I guess anomaly, there's one scene with the blind guy that like strikes me every time I see the movie. Like I think that's like my favorite part of the movie.
What about that scene?
She pretty much, I think she acts as his imagination. Like she's kind of like a guide. Everything's fast paced.
Oh, yeah,
everything's colorful.
But that's just one aspect.
Right,
I mean, she's doing that all the time.
Right, she's doing that all the time. But that scene in particular strikes me because I've had discussions with friends about like blind people and how do they have dreams or not? What do they see?
Okay. Well, that too we can come
Right.
to later. Lauren?
I don't know, so...
No, you don't have to say anything about Amélie. What about the chapters or Reality Transformed or The Lady Eve?
I guess something from The Lady Eve that's I've been thinking about a lot is I really like the character of the Eve and Jean. I really liked her character, but it just seemed I didn't like the end at all because it seemed like she was such a strong character, and then in the end she kind of almost sells out because Charles was the one that wasn't able to like understand her when she said that she'd been with all these other men, and he was the one who like freaked out, and it just, and then she was the one who basically let him back and took him back, and like it just.
Well, you're right. It is a kind of feminist movie. I mean, it's not only one of the greatest performances on film by Barbara Stanwyck, who's a great movie actress, but also it's one in which the woman is the real center. It's about her. It's about the Lady Eve. It's not about Adam, except in relation to Eve.
Yeah.
So you're right about that. Let me go on. We can come back to any of these. Now, Catherine Chang is not here. Have I called is everybody talked? All right. About now we ought to stop, but I do want to give anybody a chance to say anything. Remember, every week you can catch up and say things that you didn't have time for before. So let's go off to Amélie.